Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're totally stripping away all that pretentious academic jargon to build a practical toolkit for critically analyzing, well, absolutely any written text. A lot of people feel super intimidated by literary analysis. They think it's just reserved for scholars sitting up in ivory towers. But honestly, the truth is that analytical and critical thinking skills are incredibly fun to develop. They actually empower you to clearly and concisely create and defend your very own arguments. We are going to start from the absolute ground up today, so you really don't need to know a single thing about analysis to follow along. By the end of our time together, you're going to be able to look at the stories you read, and honestly, the media you consume, in an entirely new, deeply fascinating way. Here is our roadmap for today. First, what is literary analysis? Then, 2, 5 types of arguments. 3, choosing your critical lens. 4, the analysis process. And finally, 5, case study Edward the Emu.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1. What is literary analysis? Moving beyond the summary.
Okay, look at that word, evaluation. That is absolutely crucial here. You aren't just summarizing what happened in a story. You are building a case using actual evidence. Sure, it's an examination of a written work, but that evaluation piece means you've got to bring a specific argument to the table. Like, if you're looking at the classic fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood, you could argue it's just a standard coming-of-age tale. But you could just as easily argue that it's literally a horror story, or maybe a dark fantasy. You can argue whatever you want as long as you have the textual evidence to back yourself up. And I think this brilliantly illustrates the difference. You can't just shout your opinions at someone, right? You have to logically convince them using evidence gathered directly from the text. A summary is just telling a friend what happened in the plot, but an evaluation, that's telling them why it happened, how the author constructed it, or what it actually means right beneath the surface. You're essentially playing the role of a detective, convincing your audience that your perspective is the correct one. Moving right along to Section 2, 5 types of arguments. This is your toolkit for building a case. Think of these next 5 approaches as your foundational toolkit. First up is the Formalist Approach, also known as close reading. This one is fascinating because it's all about zooming way in on the micro details. This is where you pay almost obsessive attention to the technical parts of the text. In a graphic novel, maybe it's focusing on the fact that a character's coat completely clashes with the rest of their outfit, hinting at a false persona. In written text, it's heavily focused on the precise word choices an author uses to describe a scene, or exactly how a character speaks. Take a look at this example. The first is, "Oh my God, it's so cold. Do you want to close the window?" And the second is, "It's cold. Close the window." Notice how the exact same request changes entirely just based on the words chosen? Both sentences get the same point across. The window needs shutting. But that first sentence, it implies the speaker might be of a lower social status, or maybe they're just naturally shy and polite, so they soften the request with a question. The second sentence implies the exact opposite. That character doesn't care about formalities. Maybe they're the boss, or maybe they're just incredibly close to whoever they're talking to. A formalist argument mines these tiny, everyday linguistic differences for deep meaning. Our second tool is the applied reading. Now, this one is highly subjective because it's bridging the gap between the fiction on the page and the reality of your own life. But, and this is important, it is not enough to just say a character is relatable. No way. You have to pinpoint specific moments in the text and explain exactly how they mirror your own life using detailed examples. You're proving how the text actually functions as a mirror to real human experience. Third, we've got the comparative or synergistic argument. This is perfect for proving that multiple texts share an underlying message, or for analyzing how one specific author's themes evolve across all their books. You're hunting for strong connecting threads. You could take 2 completely different stories from totally different genres and argue that they're ultimately saying the exact same thing about human nature, or prove how they take completely opposite stances on a similar issue. Next up is the textual or historical argument. Understanding the historical context can give us modern readers a completely different understanding of why a classic piece of literature turned out the way it did. A book is a product of the time it was written in. By researching these societal, political, or economic events happening in the author's world right at the time of writing, you can unlock themes that a modern reader might otherwise completely blow past. Finally, we have the theoretical argument. Honestly, this is arguably the most common argument used in advanced analysis, and it brings us to the most important tool in our kit. This approach searches the text for specific evidence to support big, overarching theories about society, psychology, or power dynamics. And to do this effectively, we need to talk about lenses.
which perfectly tees up Section 3, choosing your critical lens, changing how you view the text.
If the argument types are your tools, your critical lens is the safety goggles you wear while working. Think of a lens literally like putting on a pair of tinted glasses. It helps you ignore all the background noise and pick up on the very specific pieces of evidence that align with the theme you're actually interested in. When you read a text without a lens, you're taking in a massive, overwhelming amount of data. A critical lens acts as a filter, highlighting exactly what you need to build your theoretical argument. There are dozens of these out there, but here are 4 incredibly common ones: psychoanalytic, feminist, Marxist, and queer lenses. For instance, you could read an anti-war text through a psychoanalytic lens to deeply study the soldier's trauma and mental states. Or you could take that exact same anti-war text and read it through a Marxist lens. Then you're focusing entirely on how the fictional society mirrors real-life economic class struggles, looking at who actually profits from the conflict. The text doesn't change one bit, but what you see changes completely based on the glasses you choose to wear. All right, Section 4, the analysis process, putting the tools to work. We've got our tools, we've got our lenses, so how do we actually do this? It comes down to a very simple, structured process. The key here? Don't try to do everything all at once. Step 1 is simply familiarizing yourself with the text. Just read it. Enjoy it. Because you've familiarized yourself first, your second read-through becomes a targeted treasure hunt for evidence. In Step 2, you put on your chosen critical lens, grab a pen, and annotate every symbol, interaction, and structural choice that supports your theory. Finally, in Step 3, you take all those sticky notes and annotations, and you actually construct your formal argument. And now for the really fun part, Section 5, Case Study, Edward the Emu, Analysis in Action. Just to prove that you can apply this stuff to absolutely anything, we're going to analyze a classic piece of children's literature. If you thought kids' books couldn't be profound enough for serious analysis, you're about to be proven wrong. The story follows Edward, an emu who is just completely bored and deeply unhappy with his life. Over the course of 4 days, he decides to become a seal, then a lion, and then a snake. Why? Because he deeply cares about the visitor's perceptions. He hears someone say the seals are the best, boom, he becomes a seal. He hears someone praise the lions, he becomes a lion. He's constantly shifting his identity based on what he overhears the crowd validating. This keeps going until he finally overhears a visitor say that, actually, the emu is by far the best animal at the zoo. Hearing this, he rushes right back to his enclosure. When Edward gets back, he finds another emu there, named Edwina. She looks at him and basically says he's the best thing she's seen since she arrived. This huge moment of validation forces us to pause and ask, what does acceptance truly mean in the context of his identity? What exactly are Edwina and the audience accepting here? Let's throw on our psychoanalytic glasses for a second. Looking through this lens, we realize Edward's core identity never actually changes. He's still an emu, no matter how hard he tries to swim like a seal or curl up like a snake. More importantly, his psychological drive, that deep desire to be viewed as the best, doesn't miraculously disappear at the end. What does change is that he finds an environment and a companion in Edwina that validates him for exactly who he is. He no longer has to pretend to be a snake or a lion to feel a sense of belonging. The psychoanalytic lens shows us a character reconciling his need for external validation with his unchangeable internal self. But watch what happens when we switch our glasses. Applying a queer lens to this simple little rhyme adds an entirely new, deeply emotional layer. Read this way, Edward's constant performing, trying to fit into different enclosures just to please the observing crowd, becomes a powerful metaphor for masking and the struggle of finding an authentic identity. Finding Edwina, that's about discovering your community. Showcasing this through a queer lens reveals exactly why this children's book is an incredibly important narrative about finding your people and being loved without having to contort yourself into some socially acceptable shape. The text itself didn't change one single bit, but just by swapping our lenses, we uncovered these huge, complex arguments about psychology, societal pressure, and belonging. Now that you have this toolkit, I've got a challenge for you. Grab one of your absolute favorite childhood books off the shelf, put on a brand new pair of theoretical glasses, and ask yourself, what profound hidden truths have been staring you in the face this entire time?